At the age of 36, Paul Kalanithi is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. One day he's a doctor and the next day he's a patient. This book, When Breath Becomes Air, is his reflection on his impending death, on the birth of a new life, his daughter, and the death of his own, the cyclical nature of life. And finally, it's a reflection on meaning and what it is to love deeply. Without further ado, let's get into it. He doesn't want a Hail Mary, I said. If he doesn't have a chance of meaningful time, he wants to take the mask off and hold Caddy. I returned to Paul's bedside. He looked at me, his dark eyes alert above the nose bridge of the BiPAP mask, and said clearly, his voice soft but unwavering, "I'm ready." Ready, he meant to remove the breathing support, to start morphine, to die. The family gathered together. During the precious minutes after Paul's decision, we all expressed our love and respect. Tears glistened in Paul's eyes. He expressed gratitude to his parents. He asked us to ensure that his manuscript be published in some form. He told me a last time that he loved me. The attending physician stepped in with strengthening words. "Paul, after you die, your family will fall apart, but they'll pull it back together because of the example of a bravery you set." Jivan's eyes were trained on Paul as Suman said, "Go in peace, my brother." With my heart breaking, I climbed into the last bed we would share. This was an excerpt from the epilogue by Lucy Kalanithi, who is Paul's wife. That was the beginning of the last few hours of Paul Kalanithi's life. She goes on to say, "We'd never imagined this scene, Paul's own deathbed, so near in our future. 22 months we cried in a bed on another floor of the same hospital as we learned of Paul's cancer diagnosis. 8 months ago we'd been together here in my hospital bed the day after Caddy was born, both napping, the first good long sleep I'd had since birth, wrapped in each other's arm." As I was reading this book, I was reminded that the only difference between us and Paul is that Paul found out that he was going to die soon, and we, on the other hand, don't know when our time is. And in reality, all of us suffer from a terminal illness, namely aging. You and I are going to die. It's simply a matter of time. It's simply a matter of when it's going to happen. No one can escape it. But some of us are lucky in a sense that we find out when we will die, and thus we can order our lives accordingly. And this is what Paul does. When he is finally confronted with his own death, all the things that he had read in grad school, undergrad, became real to him, and finally came to understand what it meant to live a good life. Our call in life is to live in accordance to wisdom, such that when death approaches, we welcome him, we aren't afraid of him, we don't try to hide from him, and we don't have to reorder everything in our lives because we're already living in accord with the way, as Confucius says. So who is Paul Kalanithi? Paul was a neurosurgeon, a writer. He was completing his residency training in neurological surgery and a postdoctoral fellowship in neuroscience when he found out about his terminal lung cancer. Died in March 2015, 22 months after he was diagnosed with stage 4, and his daughter was only 8 months old. He was unique in that he was a doctor who loved English literature, and when he was young, he never wanted to be a doctor because he had many family members who were doctors. And his only experience with medicine, he says, was by its absence. And he writes, "I knew medicine only by its absence, specifically the absence of a father growing up, one who went to work before dawn and returned in the dark to a plate of reheated dinners." He didn't want to be like his father. He didn't want to have this absence in his family. And he goes on to say, he, his father, had reached some compromise in his mind that fatherhood could be distilled. Short, concentrated, but sincere bursts of high intensity could equal whatever it was that other fathers did. All I knew was, if this was the price of medicine, it was simply too high. And it was too high because, as a child, the only thing you want is to be around your parents, is to feel the love of your parents, And the way that children can experience this is by physical presence. Though it's not always the case that physical presence means love, there is a strong sense that the more present you are in their lives, the more that they feel they can trust you, they can confide in you. And this was the opposite that Paul was feeling. But the funny thing is, when he starts practicing medicine years down the line, he does something similar to his own wife. And we see this in the book. They start to grow distant with each other. Their relationship starts to fall apart. And it's precisely because of his absence, and presumably hers too, because she's also a doctor. Because there was this lack of presence in the relationship, both physically, emotionally, because of their high demanding job, their relationship starts to come apart. But it was his tragedy, right, the lung cancer, that ends up bringing Lucy, his wife, and Paul back together. As Lucy writes in the epilogue, we each joked to close friends that the secret to saving a relationship is for one person to become terminally ill. Conversely, we knew that one trick to managing a terminal illness is to be deeply in love, to be vulnerable, kind, generous, grateful, all of which requires time and presence of mind in the relationship. And that is what a terminal illness can do to anybody. It puts time into perspective. It puts the triviality of this life into perspective. It allows you to see past the illusion. It allows you to see past the vanities. And so for Paul growing up, because he doesn't want to be a doctor, he was a voracious reader and consequently became captured by the perennial questions of life. As he writes, I was driven less by achievement than by trying to understand in earnest what makes human life meaningful. So he spends hours reading all sorts of books. Then he goes to Stanford, graduates with a BA and a MA in English literature and a BA in human biology. Then goes and completes an MPhil in history and philosophy of science and medicine at Cambridge. Then returns to the States, graduates from Yale School of Medicine. These are three of some of the most prestigious schools, and I want you to keep this in mind because later on we'll see that Paul starts to question it all as he begins to reflect more and more on his impending death. But the reason that Paul gets an MA in literature is because he was obsessed with answering the question of the meaning of life. But he ends up going into medicine because he felt that that was where he was able to come close to death, to see death, to experience death. And he believed that it was through medicine he could fully understand the, quote, physiological-spiritual, a term that was coined by the poet Walt Whitman. And the way he comes to decide that he wants to do medicine is that one day he's walking home and he hears a voice saying, set aside the books and practice medicine. It was as simple as that. And he knew right then and then that he wanted to do medicine. As he writes, hadn't Whitman himself written that only the physician could truly understand the physiological-spiritual man? So then he goes and completes his study. And on his first day as a resident student, he's delivering a baby. And the first babies that he delivers, which is a twin, they end up dying because their lungs cannot support it because they were premature. But when he's in the birthing room and delivering these babies, he writes, the neatness of medical diagrams did nothing to represent nature, read not only in tooth and claw, but in birth as well. This is the first hint to him and to us that what he knows intellectually is not the same as knowing it tangibly. And this is a theme that is going to come up again. One thing I liked about this book is that he seems to get more honest as his death approaches closer and closer. So he is most honest nearest to the end of his book, and we'll see this as we progress. And as Paul starts to go through the residency years, he sees death over and over again, all sorts of death. Young people, old people, middle age, accidents, cancers, so on and so forth. And he has this list of people that he saw die. And I want to read this list because this list captures the different varieties of people in this world. Number 1, an alcoholic, his blood no longer able to clot, who bled to death into his joint and under his skin. Every day the bruises would spread. Before he became delirious, he looked up at me and said, it's not fair. I've been diluting my drinks with water. Number 2, a pathologist, dying of pneumonia, wheezing her death rattle before heading down to the autopsy. Her final trip to the pathology lab, where she had spent so many years of her life. Number 3, a man who had a minor neurosurgical procedure to treat lightning bolts of pain that were shooting through his face. A tiny drop of liquid cement had been placed on the suspected nerve to keep a vein from pressing on it. A week later, he developed massive headaches. Nearly every test was run, but no diagnosis was ever identified. Dozens of cases of head traumas, suicides, gunshots, bar fights, motorcycle accidents, car crashes, a moose attack. And in a very real sense, Paul achieved what he wanted to achieve, which was that he came close to death, could see death, helped others escape death. And one thing this taught him, at the experience of death of his patients, he writes, "I feared I was losing sight of the singular importance of human relationships, not between patients and their families, but between doctor and patient. Technical excellence was not enough. As a resident, my highest ideal was not saving lives. Everyone dies eventually, but guiding a patient or family to an understanding of death and illness." This realization for him helps Paul become a much better doctor because he now sees his patients not as a sheet of paper with multiple issues, but as somebody, as a real person, right? His first death was an elderly woman in her 80s who he does an operation on. A few days later, she complains of a certain pain and they try to treat her, but then she ends up dying. And when he finally goes to visit the body and the body's being cut open to see what went wrong, he puts his hand over the stitches and the knots that he's tied during the operation. And that's when it becomes real for him. And that's when he goes, these people that I'm treating are human beings and I want to have a human relationship with them, not simply as a patient versus doctor, but as somebody who cares for them. And what's beautiful is that Paul gets to experience this in his own journey as he gets closer to his death, when his doctor, the head doctor, is like Paul in this sense. She treats Paul not as a patient, but as a human being who has families, who has struggles, who has dreams that might never ever get fulfilled. And this is something for us to remember, as we go about our day, whether that's doing trivial things like going to the shop, walking down the street. It doesn't cost us anything to treat the other person across checking the food out, serving us a meal at a restaurant, to treat them as a human being. Now, before Paul gets cancer, he's running the gauntlet. He's waking up every day at 5:30 to be at the hospital at 6, and he does this over and over again. And he writes, "The schedule took a toll as residents. We were working as much as 100 hours a week. Through the regulations officially capped our hours at 88 hours. There was always more work to be done." And this is completely normal. And what ends up often happening, as Paul mentions in the book, is that a lot of the residents who have dreams of, becoming great neurosurgeons, becoming great surgeons, they end up choosing what he calls lifestyle medicines, which essentially is doing plastic surgery or any sort of like cosmetic surgeries, because the time is more humane, as he writes it. It is less taxing on you, less taxing on your relationships. The pay is sometimes better. And so a lot of his classmates end up switching out and going into lifestyle medicine. Whereas Paul, for him, he feels that neurosurgery is a calling. And so he's able to endure through the residency years and at the end say, I am going to go into neurosurgery. And it's not only tough physically in terms that you have to stand, you have to do all these surgeries. It requires a lot of mental energy and it's draining in that sense, but it's also draining emotionally when you lose a patient or you do a surgery and you mess up slightly and so then the patient becomes deranged, especially because for Paul, he goes into neurosurgery since, the brain for the most part houses how we perceive the world. And for Paul, this was very important and his calling was to preserve the identity. And so when he does surgery, he's doing it as carefully as possible. He treats it as a craft. He tells the story of this kid who's about 8, comes in with some problems. Turns out there's some benign tumor in his head. They operate on it, stitch him back up. He's totally fine, running around again after, a few hours. And then years later, they bring him back in because now he's essentially turned into a person who cannot control his inhibitions. Right? And as he's getting older, he's getting stronger. Because he doesn't know how to control his inhibition, he keeps eating. And if he's angry, he just turns into a raging bull. And so his mother brings him in. And what they find out is, when they did the surgery on him when he was 8, they had accidentally damaged some part of his brain that controlled this function. And as a result, this little kid who was very cute and, who seemed to have healed well was now turning into a monster to live in. And so they ended up putting this kid in some institution. And so cases like this, Paul says, it happens, and it can be very, very draining on the surgeon, especially if they know that it was a mistake that he did. And we'll find out later on what happens specifically to one of Paul's friends when something like this takes place. One other story that comes to mind, which brings forth this idea that we're all terminally sick. We all have the same fate that we are going to die, whether tomorrow, 10 years, 20 years. The story that comes to mind is this 35-year-old woman who was going shopping for her sister's birthday, and then all of a sudden she has a seizure. And so then, the ambulance bring her in, they do a scan, and then they find out there's a brain tumor that's pressing on her right frontal lobe. And as Paul talks to her as a human being, he talks to her as somebody who has dreams, who has goals, who has relationships. He goes through all the things, the treatments that's possible. And then in the end, she chooses to go with the surgery. Because obviously the surgery carry a risk, as I mentioned with the story of the 8-year-old boy. But anyways, the surgery goes well. She returns home and she's totally fine. But this story reveals to me the ephemeral nature of our lives. At one moment, we're shopping. We think we're perfectly healthy. We're training, we're running, we're laughing. And then the next moment, we find out we have brain tumor. And that is how everything can change in a moment. And so it is important for you and I to reflect on our death as often as possible, not because we're sick and morbid, but because reflecting on your death allows you to live a life worthy of the suffering that you will endure, allows you to live a life that you are proud of, and also live a life that you're not afraid of saying goodbye to. Now with Paul, the thing that becomes obvious is that he only comes to understand death and illness through his own sickness. Until that point, death, even though he experiences it frequently through the deaths of patients, it still remains abstract to him. Right? He doesn't seem to have contemplated on the finality of death. That once you die, there's no returning. There's an end to this whole thing. And before Paul is diagnosed with cancer, there are 2 stories that come up that he mentions. One of it is a story about his friend Jeff, and then the other one is a story about a mentor called V. V is somebody who's 7 years older than Paul. He runs a successful lab. V is a professor of electric engineering and neurobiology. And he writes, "I'd never met someone so successful who's also so committed to goodness. V was an actual paragon." And what happens with V is that one day V calls Paul and they sit down. V tells Paul that he has cancer, pancreatic cancer specifically. And as they're discussing back and forth about this cancer and what possible treatments there are, V turns to Paul and asks, "Paul, do you think my life has meaning? Did I make the right choices?" Paul writes after this, "It was stunning. Even someone I considered a moral exemplar had these questions in the face of mortality." And Paul is shocked not only because V is somebody who is of high character, but because V is somebody who's running a very successful lab, internationally renowned, in a very prestigious school. But when V gets sick and is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, all these achievements and status and prizes that he's won, the accolades that he's attained, seem to have just faded away. And the only thing and the only question that comes to V's mind is, "Paul, do you think my life has meaning? Did I make the right choices?" How many people are like V, who on the surface is very successful, looks like they're thriving, and in character are good moral exemplars, but have never asked themselves whether what they're doing is what they should be doing, whether what they're doing actually has meaning, whether the actions that they're taking are motivated internally or externally. Because when you do things that are externally motivated, they will fade very quickly and will be the first things to fade when you are confronted with your mortality. But if, on the other hand, the actions that you take The decisions that you make are internally motivated and, in one sense, are bigger and greater than yourself. The possibility of your death will not deviate you from the goal, from the missions that you have. Your mortality will make you honest. If there are things you've hidden away, questions you refuse to ask yourself because they were too easy to answer, like, does my life have meaning? Is there meaning to my work? Why am I actually doing all of this? Right? If you've hidden these things away, your mortality will make sure that you're honest and make sure that you answer these questions in a way that is satisfactory to you. And these are questions that Leo Tolstoy called easy, and questions that he thought were too simple until he tried answering them. And Leo Tolstoy, we did an episode on him. So when Leo Tolstoy started questioning his whole existence, he found himself spiraling out of control because none of the answers that he provided to these questions made sense to him. And he writes, this is Tolstoy, "The question that brought me to the edge of suicide when I was 50 years old was the simplest question lying in the soul of every human being. The question without which life is impossible. Such was that way I felt about the matter. The question is this: what will come of what I do today and tomorrow? What will come of my entire existence? Expressed differently, why should I live? Why should I wish for anything or do anything? Or to put it differently, is there any meaning in my life that will not be destroyed by my inevitable approaching death?" And then later on he says this. This is again Tolstoy. "It was obvious that the resolution of all the possible questions of life could not satisfy me, because my question, no matter how simple it may seem at first glance, entails a demand to explain the finite by means of the infinite, and the infinite by means of the finite." If you still haven't read A Confession by Leo Tolstoy, I highly recommend reading that book. In Confession, you truly see a man struggling through his existence and trying to figure out why he should continue living. It's a very powerful book. Now, the other story was with one of Paul's friends named Jeff. And Jeff was a fellow surgeon. They used to be close, but Jeff moved away to the Midwest to finish up his surgical fellowship. And then they lost touch due to the hectic schedule. And one day, Paul gets a call letting me know that Jeff had committed suicide after a failed surgery. And Paul writes, "I wish I could have told Jeff what I had come to understand about life and our chosen way of life, if only to hear his wise, clever counsel. Death comes for all of us. For us, our patients, it is our fate as living, breathing, metabolizing organism. Most lives are lived with passivity towards death. It's something that happens to you and those around you." And then Paul goes on to write, "But Jeff and I had trained for years to actively engage with death, to grapple with it like Jacob with the angel, and in so doing to confront the meaning of life. But as I read this, what becomes obvious to me is that death was always at an arm's length away from Paul. He only confronted his mortality when he was diagnosed with cancer. Until that point, death happened to other people, his friends, his grandma, his patients, but never to him. And he's very right in saying most lives are lived with passivity towards death. It's something that happens to you and those around you. And it seemed that Paul, in a very real sense, became numb to death, numb to the fact that he, like his patients, would die. It's just that he was caught up in saving these patients that perhaps he never thought about dying. Perhaps he never thought about his own mortality. Because he goes on to say, "Death, so familiar to me in my work, was now paying a personal visit. Here we are, finally face to face, and yet nothing about it seemed recognizable. Standing at the crossroads where I should have been able to see and follow the footprints of the countless patients I had treated over the years, I saw instead only a blank, a harsh, vacant, gleaming white desert, as if a sandstorm had erased all traces of familiarity." And this is the crux of it all. And he goes into medicine because he thinks he'll be better able to understand death. And in a sense, he does see death frequently. But it was not through medicine that he understood death. He only understood death in the last 22 months of his life. And just based on this book and on what I've read, it seems to me that Paul only really considered what he was doing in his life and considered whether what he was doing in his life was what he truly wanted after he finds out that he has cancer. And as I mentioned earlier about his honesty, one of the parts that he's most honest is on page 198, right near the end, when he writes, "Everyone succumbs to finitude. I suspect I am not the only one who has reached this pluperfect state. Most ambitions are either achieved or abandoned. Either way, they belong to the past. The future, instead of the ladder toward the goals of this life, flans out in a perpetual present. Money, status, all the vanities of the preachers of Ecclesiastes described hold so little interest. A chasing after wind indeed." And then right in the opening of this book he writes, "The future I had imagined, the one just about to be realized, the culmination of decades of striving, evaporated." Right? It was right at the end of his life that he says, "Money, status, all the vanities of the preachers of Ecclesiastes described hold so little interest. A chasing after wind indeed." That is his realization. And the reason I said remember the schools that he went to is because up until this point, up until he writes these things, Paul is very successful by all measures. Right? He is the top of his class. He is basically offered a job without actually being offered a job by the chair of the department at Stanford, who says, "Hey, look, we're looking for a new professor for the coming year, and we think you'd be perfect. I'm not promising anything, but I think you should apply." And then Paul's very excited because this is a way of saying that we want to hire you without saying we want to hire you. And he's at the top of the game. He's won multiple awards. He's inducted into prestigious societies. He has a beautiful wife. He has the status. He has the prestige. But all of that evaporates when he gets cancer. And so the question is, what does that say about the things that we are interested in, that we strive after? What does that say about how materialistic our world is? How many of us focus on the wrong things? How many of us chase after wind? Things that will just evaporate if tomorrow you found out that you have a terminal lung cancer or that you have stage 4 brain cancer. How many of the things that you're doing right now you would stop immediately? As Paul writes, "My life until my illness could be understood as the linear sum of my choices." So that job opening at Stanford, which was something that his mentor and his chair had said should apply to him. When Paul gets cancer and he's going through all the treatment, you realize the fickleness and the replaceability of you in almost all areas of life except for in your family and your relationships. Because Paul, in the midst of his recovering, when he finally recovers for the first time and he returns to apply for this job that they told him he should apply to, they had filled the position. And you'd have to ask yourself, why did they fill this position? I assume they filled this position because they thought, well, Paul's not going to make it, so we're not even going to consider his application, even though he was the best student, even though he was the best, the rising star. The moment he got sick, they forgot about him. And I'm not saying that to bash anybody in the committee. It's just the fact of life. You are replaceable in almost all areas of life except for family, except for your relationships, and except for the gift and the skill sets that you have to do whatever it is that you have. You have a perspective to share with your friends, with your family. And so it is important to reflect on your death so that you can figure out and clarify what it is that you should be focusing your time, your attention, your energy on. You can feel the frustration when Paul writes this. "My life had been building potential that would now go unrealized. I had planned to do so much, and I had come so close. I was physically debilitated. My imagined future and my personal identity collapsed, and I faced the same existential quandaries my patients faced. The lung cancer diagnosis was confirmed. My carefully planned and hard-won future no longer existed. And later on, he confesses, I had mapped out this whole 40-year career for myself. The first 20 as a surgeon scientist, the last 20 as a writer. And now that I am likely well into my last 20 years, I don't know which career I should be pursuing. Right? You see that he's frustrated, he's upset because he had everything planned. He said he assumed that he had at least 60 years to live, and which is an assumption that we all make, that we're going to survive tomorrow, that we're going to be here in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years. But the reality is nobody knows. We are all tagged with the terminal illness of aging and of death. And he writes, one chapter of my life seemed to have ended. Perhaps the whole book was closing. Instead of being the pastoral figure aiding a life transition, I found myself the sheep, lost and confused. Severe illness wasn't life-altering. It was life-shattering. It felt less like an epiphany, a piercing burst of light illuminating what really matters, and more like someone had just firebombed the path forward. This is when death becomes real to him. And it was interesting that he writes, it felt less like an epiphany, and more like somebody had just firebombed the path forward. And I would say it certainly was an epiphany for him, because it was the first time that he confronted this reality of what he was going to do and how he was going to spend the rest of his time with his wife, with his family. And it was this sickness that allowed him and his wife to decide that they were going to have their baby daughter, Caddy. And so in a very real sense, it was an epiphany, right? It was one of these things that I say that as the book progresses, he seems to get more and more honest. Not dishonest and neither fully honest is this line. It felt less like an epiphany, because it truly was an epiphany for him. He goes on to write, like my own patients, I had to face my mortality and try to understand what made my life worth living. Torn between being a doctor and being a patient, delving into medical science and turning back to literature for answers, I struggled while facing my own death to rebuild my old life or perhaps find a new one. And Paul doesn't really go into sort of the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, but he does at one point. He's asking God why he has cancer, and he writes, I worked my whole life to get to this point, right, to the point of becoming the best neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, winning prestigious prizes, being courted by different schools. So he says, I worked my whole life to get to this point. And then you give me cancer? Because he previously had said, I've read Job, I don't understand it. You realize that my faith is fairly weak, but you didn't have to go nuclear on me, is what he writes. Paul spent the early 20s reading books, philosophy, trying to answer the perennial questions of life. What is meaning? Do we have meaning? What is life? What is love? He spent all these years reading all these books, only to then go into medicine because he thought that it was the best way to understand death and meaning and life. And in one sense, he did understand it. He confronted the death of other people. He was at the helm of saving people from death. And he was happy to do what he was doing because he felt that it was a calling, but never really asking whether it was truly a calling or whether it was something that he was doing. He was doing it driven by vanity. Because at one point he attends a gathering of Stanford Neurosurgery graduates, and he sees the future that he could now never have. He writes, my senior peers were living the future that was no longer mine. Early career awards, promotions, new houses. And this saddens him. But there's an interesting thing that happens. When he goes through his treatment the first time, he starts to get better. And he gets better, and so he goes back to work. Slowly getting back to work, slowly doing more and more shifts. And he writes, neurosurgery is really hard work, and no one would have faulted me for not going back. People often ask if it is a calling. The answer is always yes. You can't see it as a job, because if it is a job, it's one of the worst jobs there is. And he says this last sentence, that it's one of the worst jobs precisely because it's so difficult, right? You're constantly confronted with dying people, with trying to save people, with surgery, with very difficult surgeries, with long hours, very little time with family. And that's why he says it cannot be a job. It has to be a calling. And I fully agree with him. And there are many other situations where there is such a thing as this, that you have to consider certain things, certain professions, in quotes, as a calling. And if it's a calling, it's not really a profession. Because when it's a calling, you will do it no matter the season, no matter what it is you're going through. And so with Paul, he goes back to work, he starts doing these shifts, and he writes, "But the truth was, it was joyless, his neurosurgery practice. Coming home each night, I would scarf down a handful of pain pills and then crawl into bed next to Lucy, who had returned to a full work schedule as well." So Paul does this for a while. He starts to ramp up his schedule. He starts to do more operations. He's still experiencing extreme pain. He writes, "I took antiemetics, non-steroidal, anti-inflammatory drugs between cases, and just before rounds, I was suffering. But I was fully back. The more tortured my body became, the more I relished having done the work." You can sense the calling that he feels, but you can also sense what Joseph Pieper, in the previous episode that we did, Joseph Pieper calls suffering in vacuo. Suffering in vacuum, suffering just for the sake of it all, suffering to impress other people. And that's the type of suffering that many of us do in our own work. But in this case, it seems to be a bit of both. The suffering that he was enduring because he cared for his patients, and so he was willing to go through it. But in the midst of this all, he gets sick again, and then he goes back on treatment, but none of the treatment works. And he starts chemo, and it just seems to get worse and worse. And he has this one paragraph where he writes, "The way forward would seem obvious, if only I knew how many months or years I had left. Tell me 3 months, I'd spend time with my family. Tell me 1 year, I'd write a book. Give me 10 years, I'd get back to treating disease. The truth that you live one day at a time didn't help. What was I supposed to do with that day?" That's his frustration. And yet to me, contained in a day is your whole existence. You wake up to a brand new day, a day that nobody has ever experienced, a day that nobody will ever experience again once it's done. Every moment within a single day is untethered to the one from yesterday, is untethered to the one tomorrow. And so, in a very real sense, the truth that he says doesn't make sense to him, that didn't help, that you must live one day at a time, is the very truth that he embraces right in the very last moments, when he gets placed on morphine and when he is embracing his wife for the last time. To live fully present every single moment, every single day, is much more tasking mentally, physically, than anything that you and I will ever do. And it is through death that you often realize the shortness of this life. You often realize that you may have been spending time on the wrong things. The Latin phrase, memento mori, right? Remember your death, is something we should hold close to our heart. And as I mentioned earlier, the closer this book comes to the end, the more honest he gets. And it is this last section, a section of which I read earlier, I believe is most honest. Even though I'm not sure how much of these last pages he actually wrote, right? Since he died before completing his manuscript, what I assume is that in his manuscript, this last section existed in some embryonic form, whether there were a few sentences, notes, and I want to read this last section to you. "Everyone succumbs to finitude. I suspect I am not the only one who reaches this pluperfect state. Most ambitions are either achieved or abandoned. Either way, they belong to the past. The future, instead of the ladder toward the goals of life, flattens out in a perpetual present. Money, status, all the vanities the preachers of Ecclesiastes described, hold so little interest, a chasing after wind indeed. Yet one thing cannot be robbed of her futurity, our daughter Caddy. I hope I'll live long enough that she has some memory of me. Words have a longevity I do not. I had thought I could leave her a series of letters, but what would they say? I don't know what this girl will be like when she's 15. I don't even know if she'll take to the nickname we've given her. There is perhaps only one thing to say to this infant, who is all future, overlapping briefly with me, whose life, barring the improbable, is all but past. That message is simple. When you come to one of your many moments in life where you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant to the world. Do not, I pray, discount that you filled a dying man's days with a sated joy, a joy unknown to me in all my prior years, a joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied. In this time, right now, that is an enormous thing. The challenge for this week is to hold dear and love deeply those in your circle, your family, your friends, and also to reflect on your death, memento mori. And the one way to do it, and one way that I do it, is to actually reflect on what it would be like to not be in existence. And there are different methods that people do. They can imagine slowly disappearing, section by section of them going out of existence. And that's one way to reflect on your death, because it will help clarify your decisions that you have to make. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast. Give the podcast a rating. Until next week, peace.